to the MSDW Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Gumpert, editor of MSDynamicsWorld.com. Joining us today is Nucleus Research analyst Joe Mathias, author of the provocatively titled report, Cutting Through the IoT Hysteria, which was released earlier this year. Joe's expertise is in analytics, data, and IoT. The Internet of Things, or IoT, is a term that was coined in about 1997, but Joe likens the acronym IoT to the word organic for food products, one that's overused and has lost some of its meaning. Nucleus took a measured look at IoT in this report, and one last year as well called the Adult Guide to IoT Strategy in 2016. Hi, Joe Mathias. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, how are you?
Great, thanks. So I wanted to jump into a discussion of IoT and analytics and some of the views that you've been sharing recently about how they add value. You describe really a spectrum of capabilities that are, let's say, IoT related, from simple to highly complex. Could you maybe start by just walking us through how you view that spectrum?
Sure, yeah. So Nucleus, in our piece, Cutting Through the IoT Hysteria, our goal for that piece was to look at IoT, which is really a very popular buzzword in the market right now. And so as a buzzword, our job as analysts is to look at what's really going on underneath of IoT and try to elucidate a little bit what we can call IoT, what a real definition of IoT is or isn't, and help get rid of some of the marketing speak for people who want to know what's really going on underneath. And so our focus with the piece was to break down IoT into, what's called the umbrella term IoT, into a couple different components and understand how those have changed over time, to really make it less of a marketing term and make it more something that's valuable that people can understand when a vendor says, oh, we have IoT capabilities. What exactly does that mean?
You make the point that rather than looking at IoT as something that's really a differentiated type of technology, something kind of net new as sort of a new, stage or a new offering, what vendors are marketing today can really be traced back to the past couple of decades, right? Networking, technology, software, yes. Computing. It's evolved, but it's sort of a direct continuation. Is that fair to say?
Somewhat. I mean, there are some sort of new ways that old technology is being combined. And I think the combination of technologies is really what IoT is about. Certainly things like wireless networks existed before. And no one, I think, is saying, oh, wireless networks now enabling IoT. It's more the enabling function that people are focused on. But that being said, I think there's still some misunderstood elements of IoT. In misunderstood elements of the definition of IoT. So yes, you're right when you say, our stance on what IoT is, the term has become a buzzword recently, but sort of the underlying components that we'll talk about shortly are not really new. They've developed over time, and that's what we were really focusing on in our look of sort of the history of IoT. Where did it come from? How is this iteration of IoT different than past iterations of IoT? And they're sort of very similar. They weren't called IoT at the time, but 10 years ago, a similar push for integrated devices. And we look in the paper at how this iteration is a little bit different, but has some of the similar trends.
So you outlined three aspects that a true IoT product needs. Can you walk us through what those three aspects or areas are?
Sure. So we looked at the sort of IoT chain and identified three areas along the IoT chain that have changed over time. And so the first thing we talk about are the devices that are actually out in the world, the sort of IoT devices, the sensors. And those are the little sort of devices that are recording and transmitting data back. And those have changed drastically over the past, even the past few years, but certainly over the past 10 or 15 years. And so if you think about something like your iPhone, for example, well, that's a mobile device that can transmit data wirelessly back to a central hub. So you imagine all of the pieces of information that your iPhone can send if it were collecting data about weather, or if it were collecting data about manufacturing equipment. And we'll talk a little bit more about some specific examples in a second. Well, all of those devices have gotten much more complex. And so now when there are one, cheaper, and two, more sophisticated sensors out in the world, they're able to transmit a lot of information back. So that's one thing that has definitely changed. for the better in the past couple of years. The second piece of the puzzle is actually the network that's transmitting the information from the sensors to the central hub. And that has been a sticking point for IoT, especially, and I do want to make a quick differentiation between enterprise IoT and sort of personal or consumer IoT. Really what we are focusing on at Nucleus is, well, we're really focused on enterprise technology in general. So when we talk about IoT, we're really talking about enterprise IoT. So not so much talking about things like Nest thermostats or the connected home. Those are examples of IoT, but they're a little bit different than the things that we're focusing on. And so when we talk about enterprise IoT, the network, the wireless network, has been a bit of a sticking point. And we actually wrote another piece, One Less Roadblock to Enterprise IoT, and what that piece focused on was just this, was these networks. Because the problem that occurs is you have these sensors out in the world, okay, great, but battery use is a big issue. These sensors need to have a sort of very low power usage as they're constantly transmitting information back. They're not something, especially with the sort of huge number of sensors out in the world, that can be plugged in or constantly maintained. So low power usage is a big sticking point. So there are a couple of different wireless protocols that are used. The ones that everybody probably knows, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, but there are other ones like Zigbee or Z-Wave, and these are other wireless protocols specifically designed to help IoT function more efficiently in an environment within an ever-increasing number of sensors. And so you'll see these companies, Bluetooth, not that it's the Bluetooth Special Interest Group, I should say, and Wi-Fi are developing newer iterations of their wireless networks that are designed for IoT usage. So you have things like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, which are now putting a lot of effort into developing more efficient IoT-centered wireless protocols. So Bluetooth and Wi-Fi are both looking to come up with wireless protocols that are lower on power usage, have wider ranges, especially through walls, because you'll see, if you imagine in a hospital where enterprise IoT is a sort of popular place for enterprise IoT to be tried out, you have a lot of walls and a lot of obstacles. And so you need more powerful, lower power usage. And this is a technology that is really crucial, I think, for enterprise IoT specifically. You imagine in a smart home, the sort of consumer IoT, there's a little bit more flexibility for the wireless network. You don't need such a long range. The range is relatively fixed. But with enterprise, you can have a lot more sort of issues with longer range and more devices. So the network is really sort of the second part of the chain. And then on the back end of the chain, we have a third part, which is the analytics that's being used to understand the data that's coming in. And the analytics has changed quite a bit as well. So you have to imagine we're having all this information that's coming in from new sources or more varied information from sources that we already had, things like weather data, manufacturing equipment, utilities equipment, and all this information is coming in, but it doesn't do us any good to have all that information if we don't have a way of analyzing it and understanding it better. And so the progress of analytics software in the past couple of years has proved to be really beneficial to the potential of IoT. We have a lot more visual analytics, a lot more powerful engines, things like Spark, open source platform, and other open source platforms, which are allowing companies to have a much better understanding of their data because they're able to do a lot more with it. That being said, another important trend in analytics in the past few years that is really important for IoT is the increasing importance of streaming analytics or micro batch analytics. And essentially what that means is you have near real-time understanding of the data. So you have data coming in and it's being analyzed almost immediately and incorporated with other data almost immediately. To contrast this with older versions of analytics, or what we call batch jobs for analytics, you have data come in for, let's say, 1 day, and then you run an analytics job on 1 day's worth of data. But with streaming analytics, you're able to utilize the data that's coming in and incorporate it with older data almost instantaneously. Micro batches can be as short as 30 seconds. And so the developers at Spark have been really focusing on improving their platform. A lot of companies that use streaming analytics now use it with some form of Apache Kafka. And Kafka is being sort of souped up as well as its integration with Spark. And so the developers at Spark are really focusing on streaming analytics. When you think about a business that has to make decisions on a sort of tactical, near real-time basis, for example, marketing for companies that they're looking at data coming in from their website. And so across 100 browsers or 1,000 browsers of people looking at their website, they want to be able to make real-time recommendations to their customers. That's something that relies a lot on streaming analytics to be able to incorporate information coming in from that customer's browser with information they already have about sort of similar customers that will be able to allow the company to have more targeted marketing and will overall improve the customer's experience. So that's sort of a long-winded way of saying we have these three parts of IoT, the sensors and devices themselves being more sophisticated and us having access to more of them, stronger networks, and better analytics on the back end.
Okay, great. I mean, by those definitions, I think one of the conclusions that you reach, or maybe one of the arguments you're making, is that a lot of what's marketed as IoT pulls in these three different areas of improvement. And I sense that one of the things it also does is by virtue of the improvements in the technology is that it's more accessible, and it's now much more, it looks much more realistic as something that more companies could invest in than they maybe would have thought a few years ago. Like companies that wouldn't have thought they were candidates for these kinds of technologies as part of their business can now start thinking about, oh, well, maybe I could justify investing, however much to get some of those benefits that weren't, within our reach before because they were too expensive, required personnel that was too specialized. Is that part of the change right now? Is that what marketers are trying to get to the buyers?
Sure. Well, so let's talk about the marketing a little bit. All the things that I had just mentioned, that's what's marketed as IoT. That's really sort of, if we peel back the marketing layers, what's really changing in the market? Those three things are definitely changing and have a big impact for a company's data. However, that does not necessarily constitute IoT. And it's a bit tricky for me because I'm using a sort of, the marketing term IoT is what I described. It's really those three functions improving simultaneously to make this integrated sensor-based data picture of a business more accessible, more powerful. However, in Nucleus's perspective, that doesn't necessarily make IoT, and I'll explain why. When we look at those different, IoT really is a buzzword that marketers are using now. Okay, so is it a net new product? And our view of it is, no, it's not really, because we can look at those three different aspects that I mentioned earlier, and we can see that a lot of those were present in years gone by. And IoT has cropped up in the past few years, but those devices, those analytics engines, those are not totally new. And so one thing that we really, one trend that I think is really important to understand is look at RFID of about 13 years ago. RFID was the radio frequency ID tags that were incorporated for a relatively low cost into a variety of products that could relay certain pieces of information. And that might sound a little bit vague, and that's really one of the issues with RFID. It was a little bit vague. RFID tags were initially about $1 a piece, which is a little bit expensive, but everyone thought, hey, okay, the price is going to come down. That's not going to be a problem. We'll be able to use the RFID tags. But the RFID tags were a bit of a solution looking for a problem. Initially, people thought that ways that they could use RFID tags would be something like stick an RFID tag on a box of cereal. When the customer checks out, they just walk right through. The scanner can scan the RFID tags. They don't have to, manually scan a barcode. And they saw this, as one application of the RFID tags as a replacement for barcodes. Okay, great. So in theory, that seems like a cool idea. But the problem is, from a business perspective, and we're always looking at the business side of things, it's not actually cost effective. RFID tags needed to be under 1 cent each to compete with a barcode. And really, they only got down to 5 or 6 cents a piece. And so we had this idea of, this great sensor that can do a task like, the self-checkout is sort of one example. Another example is tracking inventory in a warehouse. Okay, that's maybe a cool function that in a perfect world where the tags cost zero money, that we could use this. However, they never really could get to that point. And that's why RFID really fell off. It was a buzzword, and it never really caught on. So one of the reasons that we wrote the IoT piece is to say, hey, let's not get so caught up in this buzzword and understand that the tech world has had trends in the past that seem great and seem very cool, but really are solutions looking for a problem, and maybe they don't actually find that problem. So to answer your initial question, is IoT developing, or I'll say quote unquote IoT, developing in ways that make it more business viable? Yes, it is. And I think when we understand the different parts of IoT, it becomes a little bit more clear that as those three individual aspects of sort of what marketers call IoT, that we're sort of saying, hey, it's not necessarily IoT. We had these devices in the past. We had wireless networks in the past. We had analytics in the past. Well, they're all better now. And so from a business perspective, yes, there are definitely more viable applications that are cheaper of this sort of integrated data picture of your business. So to give you one, I think, better example, maybe a more clear example would be if we take a look at utilities companies. Utilities companies have a lot to gain from increased what we call instrumentation, which is essentially the sensors out in the world that are bringing data in. But a sensor alone doesn't necessarily make IoT. That being said, the sensors provide a lot of important information for utilities companies. In years of the past, there were people who would come around and read the meters on individual houses, and I'm sure it's still like that for some places, but utilities companies that we've spoken to recently talk about ways that they're able to use these sensors in order to better estimate, better manage, better keep the customer informed about their utilities usage. And that's sort of a very clear, I think, example of how having a sensor out in the world on your utilities equipment out in the field is able to relay data back to you that's very useful and cuts down on a lot of manual time that would be spent collecting that information, and automatically loads it right up into whatever sort of analytics platform you're using, or just into your company's database. So it eliminates actually sort of 2 steps in the process of both recording and loading and integrating the data. Another example for instrumentation out in the world that would be beneficial is something like a manufacturing company. Smart manufacturing floors, like smart machines on the floor, are something that a lot of companies are investing in. And there are certain applications that are a little bit less obvious than the utilities, but understanding the machine's performance in real time can indicate when there are inefficiencies arising. Predictive maintenance is one thing that a lot of companies talk about. And those just sort of make the pipeline of manufacturing a lot smoother because it gives you a better, more real-time insight into what's going on with individual machines. So there's just sort of 2 examples of instrumentation, what we call instrumentation, that has improved over time and is allowing other companies that weren't necessarily interested in IoT, sort of quote-unquote IoT, to begin with, to now invest in it. So you have sort of on the more obvious end, utilities companies doing things as simple as meter reading. Now moving on to more advanced applications of these sort of sensor devices that I think, based on the improved sophistication of the devices, that they're able to bring in more and more diverse types of information, is definitely allowing companies to think more seriously about how IoT could have a positive impact for them.
Yeah, I wanted to just check with you on another sort of approach I think is along those same lines that I've been seeing from Microsoft in particular, because they have field service capabilities, and then they have obviously Azure, their own Azure IoT suite, and the case of detecting issues and items that have been sold to a customer and sort of monitoring those items for issues and dispatching field services based on what the readings from the field, perhaps. Another example that's along those same lines, would you say?
Sure, yeah. It's an interesting example that you bring up because I think that that's a good example of where IoT is not really so much IoT. Understanding products, the customer experience with products or when a product is going to fail is definitely useful. There's no doubt about that. But is it really this sort of net new thing? Is it really a sort of shiny object IoT? And that's where we would say no. In talking about other instances that are similar to that, let's see. I would say that it is better to think about IoT as less of a sort of product offering in and of itself as it is a variety of sort of business technology processes working together. So, it's not to say that what Microsoft is doing is not valuable at all, but rather to say, is this really IoT? And I would say no, with the upshot of that helping to inform us about what other companies are doing. Because we've seen a lot of IoT recently in some of the companies that we've talked to, and they tell us, oh yeah, we have IoT. Our price tags in our grocery stores can tell us information about the customer standing in front of them. And again, this is what sometimes we call it Nucleus shiny object syndrome. Seems great. What's the really practical application? And so what we see as an issue with the term IoT is that it applies the sort of shiny object syndrome across a lot of range of products. Some of those products are really beneficial, like the utilities companies, like what Microsoft is tracking their products in the field. That's sort of, I would say, a problem that they have now solved, as opposed to pulling in data willy-nilly from whatever range of sources, wherever data can be pulled from. Now we're pulling in data from there. That's really what we're trying to suss out and show as being that sort of solution looking for a problem. The problem with the term IoT is it doesn't really differentiate between the two of them. And from a business perspective, from a consumer perspective, sure, you can invest in making your home smart because it's a relatively low investment. If you want your fridge to be able to tell you that you have one egg left, that's fine. You can do that. In my sort of personal opinion, it seems a bit of maybe a function that has very limited utility. But from an enterprise perspective, it's really important to eliminate those redundancies. You really want to maximize the return you get on your investment. From a business perspective, it's really not about if it's cool. It's about if it's actually providing really financial benefits for your company. And so in helping to distinguish sort of useful examples of what is termed IoT, like tracking meters, products in the field, we really want to point out the differences between those products and sort of less useful products from a business perspective. And I think that by breaking down those three things that we initially started talking about, and companies can see, oh, okay, these are actually the sort of underbelly of what's going on with IoT. They can say, hey, you know what? My company would really benefit from having sensors on some sort of product or some sort of piece of equipment that we have, because we always have problems with those pieces of equipment that we can't really predict properly. Okay, so that's a problem that we've identified before going into some sort of IoT investment, before going into some sort of IoT voyage, because our some person from the marketing department feels like it's going to be a positive sort of word to have associated with the business, that we can actually find issues that can be solved by improved sensors and improved analytics.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying there goes along with another thing I was just thinking of. I was able to have a conversation with someone, again, just going back to Microsoft as an example. It was about a year and a half ago, who's on their IoT team, I think a product management person, and we were sort of talking informally, but what he told me was they were really in the stage at that point, and it's so again maybe 18 months ago, where they were really encouraging their clients and even I guess coaching their partners who were talking to the partner clients to really just start mapping some of those needs, right? Like where could you benefit from knowing from taking sensor data that you maybe could already pull or adding or updating devices, and like really starting from that very sort of baseline sort of point of even thinking about where these investments might come from. I mean, that's where Microsoft seemed to be at, and I think that sort of lines up with what you're saying. That companies really have to start at the beginning if they haven't already been doing work with sensors and data analysis based on devices, right?
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that completely. And I'm glad to hear that was the sort of thing that Microsoft was focusing on, because that's really the best business approach to these sort of things. And that's why we're trying to get away from the world. As an analyst, marketing to me it's sort of over my head. I'm not really interested in marketing at all. I really want to know what's going on underneath. And so by sort of getting rid of that veil of marketing, that is what we're focusing on. We're focusing on business benefits. And that's really part of the Nucleus methodology. We're looking at not just business benefits, but quantifiable business benefits. Yeah, to talk about something like analytics, yeah, you're right. Analytics is something that I think most companies are recognizing are a really important part of their business strategy. Most companies are saying, hey, we are getting data and we need to understand it. And so it is a sort of balancing act between the data that you get in and the way that you understand that data, and that's really sort of at the crux of this analytics instrumentation, what's called IoT balancing act here. You have, what data do you have and how well do you understand it? If you have more data than you can understand, you don't need sensors out in the world that are going to give you more data about X and Y customer products and things like that. You need better analytics that are going to help you understand it. On the back end, if there are really sort of like dark areas, sort of foggy aspects of the business where you don't really have insight into, you're not getting the data out of it, then that is something that you should invest in. So going from a need to a product deployment is definitely the way to go. I mean, they say necessity is the mother of invention, right? Yeah. So the thing we want to avoid is where we have these inventions that are coming out because we can make them, or they seem cool, or they seem like they might have a business use, and go back to the needs portion and really identify that more strongly.
The other thing that seems to me like it could be a risk, because, I kind of gave you that input I got from someone at Microsoft, but I also sense, and I'll just use them as an example, they want to take, obviously, their own offerings further, and I suspect a lot of vendors do, where, okay, they give you these baseline capabilities you can apply to your business, but they also want to, and I think you may have alluded to this in your report, they also want to make it easy to have pre-built connections to get up and running quickly, obviously, to lower the upfront investment to make a project like this that brings in these capabilities successful. So is vendor lock-in or sort of a long-term dependence on one vendor, is that a concern that you're seeing from buyers, and is it something you're seeing as a risk from the offerings that are out there right now?
Sure. So you're saying if a customer is working with one specific vendor, they want to make sure that their data and that the various products that they have working in their sort of network are all compatible?
Right. And that if they wanted to in the future, they could, make a change to a component without really blowing up the whole system.
Sure. I'll say I don't think that it's necessarily a big issue that I've seen with any customers that we've talked to, mostly because fortunately there's a lot of flexibility with sort of point solutions or deployments of one product in one area of your company and a different product in another area of your company. And even if you think about open source platforms like Apache Spark or Hadoop, there are actually a lot of connectors that can be integrated from, for example, there might be analytics platforms that you can build on Spark that you can then use various connectors from other companies to improve. And there are also ways of making the Spark platform more efficient. There are some companies that I've talked to recently that have a product solely designed to improve the performance of Spark clusters. So you really have a lot of people in the tech market that are working on the connecting and the integrating and the speeding up of certain processes. So I guess maybe another answer to the question would be, yes, big companies, the sort of mega vendors, Microsoft, SAP, Oracle, really big companies like that, they have products across a whole range of departments. And so, yeah, I'm sure that there are some aspects that work more smoothly if you're using Microsoft for various different stages of this sort of interconnected business outlook. But at the same time, there are a lot of smaller vendors that are just offering an analytics solution. But that by no means means that their analytics solution has some sort of data integration problems or anything like that. They're really well designed and well updated to be able to pull in data from a variety of sources. And I think don't really run into issues as you're using like a few different solutions for a few different processes. I guess another thing to add to that is really the cloud, the move to the cloud, where really almost all solutions are being offered on the cloud now, simplifies that process a lot. When you don't have a huge hardware investment that's a little bit more static, it's a lot easier to integrate things from different, integrate different products and different branches of your organization, and then pull them together in some sort of cohesive management of your data. And when you have analytics solutions that are entirely on the cloud, for example, it's really easy to, if you find, hey, I have there's some sort of data source that I don't have the proper data connector to pull that in to my analytics platform. Third-party developers or even your own internal development team, it usually had no problem developing a data connector for that. So I would say overall, no, it's not so much an issue.
Mm-hmm. And, like you were saying, cloud is making things perhaps more accessible, more straightforward when it comes to some of the complications that you face with your own on-premise data center, perhaps. In your observation, is adoption of these technologies really scaling up at this point? Do you see companies you talk to really, or do you see, I guess, overall more companies making those investments today, or is it going to be a longer-term trend that's going to take longer to develop?
The move to the cloud, you mean?
No, I mean adoption of some of these technologies that kind of factor into building something that looks like IoT or advanced instrumentation, if you want to call it that.
Sure. Yes. Okay. I understand. I think that it will slow down. There's been a lot of hype in the past year and a half around IoT, and we've seen a lot of IoT sort of product offerings. I think that it will slow down a little bit as companies start to evaluate more exactingly what it will actually do for their business. I've talked to a few customers who have implemented sort of parts of products that are IoT, sort of quote unquote IoT enabled, and they haven't found necessarily great benefits out of it yet. And so what that tells me is, again, that it was sort of something that the vendor really wanted to push and that hasn't necessarily been realized in terms of tangible benefits by the customer. And so I think there's going to be a period where companies slow down a little bit, and once the sort of next big shiny object comes along, AI is a big one right now, and businesses start to be less interested in just the marketing term of IoT and more interested in what exactly IoT can do for them, that they'll take a more measured look at the benefits and then are probably a little bit slower to adopt as they see other companies successfully deploying and see really concrete manifestations of what IoT can do. I think the cloud is maybe a good example because the cloud was sort of suspicious for a little while. Enterprises thought, well, the cloud, what is this cloud thing? Is it safe? Can I trust it? Is it really going to be better than on-premise? I sort of like my servers being in my basement. But a lot of new companies, I would say almost all new companies, looking for analytics or other solutions that can be done on the cloud are preferring the cloud because there's been a proven track record of benefits of the benefits of the cloud just outstripping that of on-premise. So if you think of that as an example, yeah, you have this sort of maybe a new technology that seems like it could have great deployments, but companies are a little bit slow to adopt it until they see that there actually are those sort of history of positive benefits. And I think with IoT, it's going to be the similar thing. One difference with IoT is every company is going to be using it in slightly different ways. So we have those examples I brought up earlier of utilities companies. Well, that's all good and well, but if you are, in a different industry, you may not have the similar applications. So it's important for, I think, companies who are evaluating IoT options to really understand, okay, well, this company had a positive deployment, but why? How is that applicable to my company? What sort of investment is it going to take? How much of my internal IT team's time am I going to have to use to manage this? Because it's another important aspect when you're looking at the benefits. Inevitably, because each deployment is different, there's going to be a level of customization that has to go on. And that customization will have to be handled, probably internally. Or maybe with a sort of consultation partner. So those are important questions to ask, going in. What sort of resources is this going to take, and is that going to be worth my time? And it takes a little bit for the market to get used to that. Businesses have a lot on their plate already. IT teams have a lot on their plate already. So they don't want to be wasting time on a deployment where they're not sure if IoT is really going to have a positive impact.
Yeah, interesting. I can imagine, based on what you're saying there, vendors pushing for a lot more reference customers that they can use to show off some of those benefits in as many different industries as they can. And I mean, it sounds like a lot of what you're describing is it's the kind of challenge that a good IT director can already sort of map out, not just for these particular technologies, but for any investment, I think, in software or hardware or infrastructure, trying to map some of the technology to the benefits that the business needs and make that case rather than getting sort of sucked into, to the marketing speak or to some of the sales promises, right, that the software companies are going to make.
Definitely, yeah, I think so. And I mean, as far as I know, IT directors are also usually somewhat uninterested in marketing speak. So I think that they are definitely the ones who have the ground level view of where business processes can be improved from an increased amount of data understanding. But there has to be, again, the IT team recognizing issues that can be improved has to translate into financial benefits, because they're not the ones who are necessarily choosing. They're not the ones holding the purse strings. And so I guess this is, sort of fits into the Nucleus methodology. What we try to do here at Nucleus is really the same thing that the IT director would need to do, which is to make a quantifiable message for the benefits that a particular project will have for the company. And so they have to go from recognizing problems to then the second step, which is seeing how other companies have solved these problems. And that comes from things like case studies or reference customers. And then mapping that onto their own company's needs to get a really sort of clear financial viewpoint, not just a qualitative, but a quantitative understanding of the sort of challenges that the company is currently facing. So, if this is sort of the way that Nucleus views these sorts of issues, if you have a lack of data insight or sort of an analytics engine that's not cutting it, how is that affecting the productivity of your sales team, of your marketing team, of your engineering team, of your IT team? And how does that productivity then translate into dollars lost? And so when you look at it from that sort of a perspective, and that's really the conceptual jump that's really important in understanding what IoT can do for your business, for one individual business, you have to be able to move between the problem and the actual sort of concrete benefits.
Well, Joe, I think we'll end it there. I wanted to thank you again for joining us today. This is the report was really interesting, and we'll obviously link that up in the description here. And it really helped me, I think, sort of understand a very sort of rational, reasonable way to sort of explain what vendors are offering in the market and make sense based on what I already knew and maybe some of the things I don't know yet from across there. So thank you so much for bringing that to us and talking us through it today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
This has been another episode of the MSDW Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and my thanks again to Joe Mathias for joining. If you have any comments about the podcast, drop us a line. You can reach me, Jason Gumpert, by email at jgumpert@msdynamicsworld.com. Until next time, this is MS Dynamics World signing off.